The screams echoed across the fjord long after the last longship had vanished into the morning mist. On the rocky shore of what would one day become Dublin, scattered remnants told a story no saga would ever sing. Broken chains still warm from human flesh. Wooden posts driven deep into stone, their surfaces stained dark with something that wasn't seawater. And carved into the cliff face above, fresh runes that spelled out not victory, but ownership. The Vikings had come and gone, but they hadn't come for gold or glory alone. They had come for something far more valuable in their world: human cargo. Living, breathing merchandise that would fetch fortunes in markets stretching from Greenland to Constantinople. What happened to those prisoners in the hours, days, and years that followed wasn't just captivity. It wasn't even slavery as most civilizations understood it. It was something darker, more systematic, more deliberately cruel than death itself. Welcome to Scandalous Pasts, where we uncover the stories history tried to bury. Today, we're sailing into the blood-soaked wake of the most feared raiders in human history, not to glorify their conquests, but to expose the horrifying truth about what they did to those they captured. From the ritual humiliations that broke spirits before bodies, to the slave markets that turned human beings into currency, to the sacrificial ceremonies that made death seem merciful by comparison. Before we begin this journey into the darkest corners of Viking brutality, remember to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next descent into history's most shocking secrets. Now, steel yourself. We're about to discover why, for countless thousands of prisoners, facing a Viking blade in battle would have been a blessing they never received. The hunt for human treasure. The morning raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD wasn't just the beginning of the Viking age, it was the debut of a new kind of warfare entirely. When those dragon-prowed ships emerged from the North Sea fog, the monks inside the monastery thought they were seeing merchants or perhaps pilgrims. They were wrong. They were seeing the birth of Europe's most efficient human trafficking operation. The Vikings didn't just stumble into the slave trade. They engineered it. Every aspect of their society, from their shipbuilding to their seasonal calendars, revolved around one central economic reality: human beings were the most valuable commodity in the medieval world. A healthy adult slave could be worth more than a farm, more than a herd of cattle, more than a chest of silver. And the Vikings had perfected the art of harvesting this living treasure. Their longships weren't just vessels of war, they were floating prisons designed with human cargo in mind. Archaeological evidence from ship burials reveals modifications that served no purpose in battle but made perfect sense for transporting captives. Iron rings bolted to the hull. Reinforced deck planking to support the weight of chained prisoners. Even specialized drainage systems to handle the inevitable human waste during long voyages. The raids themselves followed a brutal calculus. Vikings didn't attack randomly, they studied their targets for months, sometimes years. They knew when monasteries received their annual tributes, when market towns held their largest fairs, when coastal villages would be swollen with seasonal workers. They struck not just for immediate plunder, but for maximum human yield. Contemporary accounts describe the methodical nature of these captures. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records how Viking raiders would systematically separate their prisoners by age, health, and apparent value. Children under 10 were often killed immediately, too small to work, too young to fetch good prices. The elderly met similar fates. But everyone else, from teenage girls to middle-aged craftsmen, became inventory in a business that spanned continents. The psychological warfare began immediately. Vikings understood that broken spirits were easier to transport than defiant ones. Captives were forced to watch as their homes burned, their families were separated, their religious symbols were desecrated. The message was clear: your old life is over. Your new existence begins now, and it belongs to us. But the true horror wasn't in the capture, it was in what came next. Because for Viking prisoners, the raid was just the beginning of a nightmare that could last decades. The breaking process, what the Vikings did to their prisoners in those first crucial hours after capture, reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that would make modern interrogators shudder. They had perfected what we might now call systematic dehumanization, a process designed not just to prevent escape, but to fundamentally alter how captives saw themselves. The first step was always the same, the stripping away of identity. Prisoners were forced to discard their clothes, their jewelry, anything that marked them as individuals with histories and homes. Names were replaced with numbers or crude descriptors. The priest, the blacksmith's daughter, the one with the limp. Personal identity was the first casualty of Viking captivity. Then came the marking. Using heated iron brands or crude tattoos made with soot and needles, Vikings would mark their human property with symbols indicating ownership, origin, and intended use. These marks weren't just practical, they were psychological weapons. A branded captive could never again look at their own body without being reminded of their status as property. The chains came next, but not the simple iron shackles you might imagine. Viking restraints were engineered for maximum psychological impact. Heavy iron collars connected multiple prisoners together, making individual escape impossible without abandoning fellow captives. Ankle chains were deliberately sized to allow walking but prevent running. Wrist manacles were crafted to chafe and cut with every movement, ensuring constant physical reminders of captivity. But perhaps most insidious was the deliberate destruction of social bonds. Vikings understood that humans draw strength from relationships, so they systematically shattered every connection their prisoners had. Families were separated immediately and permanently. Spouses were sold to different buyers, children were taken from parents, siblings were scattered across different ships. The isolation was absolute and intentional. The feeding regimen was another tool of control. Prisoners received just enough food to maintain basic health, but never enough to feel satisfied. Hunger became a constant companion, weakening both body and will. Water was similarly rationed, creating a state of perpetual thirst that made captives grateful for any small mercy from their captors. Sleep deprivation completed the arsenal of psychological warfare. Prisoners were kept awake during transport through a combination of uncomfortable positions, constant noise, and deliberate disturbances. Exhaustion made resistance nearly impossible and clouded judgment, making captives more compliant and less likely to attempt escape. The Vikings also employed what modern psychologists would recognize as learned helplessness. Prisoners were given arbitrary rules that changed without warning. Punishments were handed out randomly, regardless of behavior. This created a state of constant anxiety where captives never knew what might trigger violence, leading them to become increasingly passive and submissive. Religious and cultural symbols were systematically destroyed or perverted. Christian prisoners were forced to participate in pagan rituals. Sacred objects were used for profane purposes. This spiritual assault was often more devastating than physical torture, stripping away the last vestiges of the captives' former identities. By the time the ships reached their destinations, the transformation was complete. The proud farmers, skilled craftsmen, and devout monks who had been captured were gone. In their place were broken, compliant shadows of their former selves, ready to accept whatever fate their new owners decided for them. The slave markets of the North. The Great Slave Market at Hedeby wasn't just a place of commerce, it was the beating heart of a human trafficking network that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean Sea. When Viking longships pulled into the harbor, their most valuable cargo wasn't amber or furs or silver. It was the chained men, women, and children who stumbled down the gangplanks into a world where human flesh was just another commodity to be bought, sold, and traded. The market operated with the efficiency of a modern corporation. Specialized dealers handled different types of human merchandise. Some focused on skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers whose abilities commanded premium prices. Others dealt in domestic servants, particularly young women whose value was measured not just in their capacity for labor, but in their potential for bearing children who would themselves become property. The inspection process was deliberately dehumanizing. Potential buyers examined prisoners like livestock, checking teeth for health, muscles for strength, hands for calluses that indicated useful skills. Women of childbearing age underwent invasive examinations to determine their reproductive potential. Children were assessed for their capacity to survive the rigors of slavery and their potential for training in specialized tasks. Prices varied wildly based on origin, skills, and physical condition. A healthy Irish monk might fetch the equivalent of 8 cows, his literacy making him valuable as a scribe or tutor. A young Frankish woman could command even higher prices, particularly if she showed signs of noble birth. Skilled metalworkers from England were prized throughout Scandinavia for their superior techniques in weapon making. But the market at Hedeby was just one node in a vast network. Viking traders established slave depots throughout their territories, creating a supply chain that could move human cargo efficiently across thousands of miles. Temporary holding facilities dotted the coastlines of Ireland, Scotland, and northern England. These weren't crude pens, but sophisticated operations with guards, administrators, and even primitive medical facilities to maintain the health of valuable merchandise. The transportation network was equally impressive. Special slave ships, larger and more heavily built than typical longships, could carry hundreds of prisoners on longer voyages. These vessels were floating hells, with captives chained in holds barely tall enough to sit upright, breathing air thick with the stench of human waste and despair. The international trade routes reveal the staggering scope of Viking human trafficking. Irish slaves were particularly prized in Iceland, where they provided the labor force needed to establish new settlements. English captives were shipped to Norway and Denmark, where their agricultural skills were valued. But the most lucrative trade flowed eastward, down the great rivers of Russia toward Constantinople and the Islamic world. In the markets of Kiev and Novgorod, Viking traders exchanged their human cargo for Byzantine gold and Islamic silver. These eastern routes were so profitable that entire expeditions were organized solely for slave-taking. The Volga River became a highway of human misery, with Viking ships carrying thousands of captives toward markets where they would disappear forever into the vast slave populations of the Islamic world. The economic impact was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that Vikings captured and sold over 500,000 people during the height of their raiding period. Some historians argue the number was much higher, possibly exceeding 1 million. Entire regions were depopulated by systematic slave raids. The demographic impact on Ireland, Scotland, and northern England was so severe that it affected population patterns for centuries. But behind these cold statistics lay individual tragedies beyond counting. Each number represented a life destroyed, a family shattered, a future stolen. The slave markets of the North weren't just centers of commerce, they were the machinery of a Holocaust that history has largely forgotten. The thrall system, slavery perfected what awaited prisoners who were purchased rather than resold, was entry into the thrall system, Viking society's answer to the question of how to extract maximum value from human property. Unlike slavery in other cultures, which often allowed for eventual freedom or integration, the thrall system was designed to be permanent, hereditary, and absolutely inescapable. Thralls weren't just slaves, they were a separate caste of humanity, considered fundamentally different from free people. Viking law codes made this distinction explicit. A thrall who killed a free person faced death, but a free person who killed a thrall paid only a modest fine, roughly equivalent to the cost of replacing a farm animal. This wasn't just legal inequality, it was the codification of the belief that thralls were subhuman. The work assigned to thralls was deliberately designed to be both essential and degrading. They performed the backbreaking labor that Viking society depended on but that free people considered beneath their dignity. Thralls cleared forests, drained swamps, built roads, and worked the mines that produced the iron for Viking weapons. They were human machines, worked until they broke and then replaced. Female thralls faced additional horrors. They were expected to serve not just as laborers but as concubines for their masters. Children born from these forced unions became thralls themselves, creating a self-perpetuating system of hereditary bondage. Viking law explicitly stated that children followed the status of their mothers, ensuring that the thrall population would continue to grow through forced reproduction. The living conditions for thralls were deliberately harsh. They were housed in crude shelters, often little more than holes dug into the ground and covered with turf. Their diet consisted of scraps and refuse, just enough to maintain basic health but never enough for comfort. Clothing was minimal and of the poorest quality, leaving thralls constantly cold and uncomfortable. Punishment for thralls was swift and brutal. Minor infractions resulted in beatings, reduced rations, or increased workloads. More serious offenses could lead to mutilation, the cutting off of ears, noses, or fingers as permanent markers of disobedience. The most severe punishment was sale to the Eastern markets, a fate considered worse than death because it meant complete separation from any familiar faces or customs. The psychological control was as sophisticated as the physical restraints. Thralls were taught from their first day of captivity that resistance was futile and that their only hope for survival lay in complete submission. They were given new names that emphasized their status as property. They were forbidden from practicing their original religions or maintaining their cultural traditions. Even their language was gradually stripped away, replaced with just enough Norse to understand orders. Perhaps most cruelly, the Vikings created a hierarchy among their thralls, giving some slightly better treatment or minor privileges in exchange for helping to control others. This divide-and-conquer strategy prevented thralls from uniting against their oppressors and ensured that escape attempts would be quickly reported. The economic efficiency of the thrall system was remarkable. A healthy thrall could be expected to produce value equivalent to their purchase price within 2 to 3 years, after which they represented pure profit for their owners. This economic incentive ensured that the system would continue to expand, with successful Vikings investing their wealth in acquiring more human property. But the true horror of the thrall system wasn't its efficiency, it was its permanence. Unlike other forms of slavery that offered paths to freedom through service, conversion, or purchase, the thrall system offered no hope of escape. A person who became a thrall could expect to die a thrall, as would their children and their children's children, trapped forever in a cycle of bondage that stretched across generations. The blood eagle and ritual torture. When the Vikings wanted to send a message that would echo through generations, they turned to practices so horrifying that even their enemies' chroniclers struggled to find words to describe them. The blood eagle wasn't just execution, it was a ritualized transformation of human suffering into religious spectacle, a ceremony that turned death into art and agony into worship. The process began with the selection of the victim, usually a captured king, noble, or religious leader whose death would carry maximum symbolic weight. The prisoner was kept alive and aware throughout the entire procedure, which could last for hours. They were stripped naked and forced face down onto a stone altar while the entire community gathered to witness the spectacle. The ritual cutting began at the spine. Using a sharp knife or axe, the executioner would make parallel cuts along either side of the victim's backbone, carefully avoiding major blood vessels to prevent quick death. The ribs were then methodically broken away from the spine and pulled outward, creating the appearance of wings. The skill required was considerable. Too deep a cut would kill the victim too quickly, too shallow would fail to achieve the desired effect. With the ribcage opened like a grotesque flower, the executioner would reach inside and carefully extract the victim's lungs, pulling them out through the opening and spreading them across the exposed ribs. If performed correctly, the victim would still be alive and conscious, their lungs functioning outside their body for several agonizing minutes before death finally claimed them. But the blood eagle was just the most famous of the Vikings' ritual tortures. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts describe a catalogue of horrors that reveals the sophisticated cruelty of Norse religious practices. The practice of wound weaving involved making systematic cuts across a victim's body in intricate patterns, creating designs that were believed to please the gods while maximizing suffering. Salt torture was another favored method, particularly for prisoners taken from coastal raids. Victims would be stripped and covered in coarse sea salt, then left in the sun. As their skin dried and cracked, more salt would be rubbed into the wounds. The process could take days, with the victim experiencing increasing agony as their skin literally dissolved while they remained conscious. The tree of pain was a crucifixion variant that involved nailing victims to living trees, but with the nails driven through non-vital areas to prolong suffering. Arms, legs, and torso would be pierced and attached to branches, leaving the victim hanging in impossible positions while ravens and other scavengers began to feed on their still-living flesh. For female prisoners, the Vikings developed gender-specific tortures that combined sexual violence with religious ritual. The Bride of Odin ceremony involved the systematic mutilation of a woman's reproductive organs while she was kept alive and conscious. The victim's screams were believed to carry messages to the god of war, making her suffering a form of prayer. Children weren't spared from these ritual horrors. Young prisoners were sometimes subjected to growing sacrifices, where they were buried alive up to their necks and left to die slowly as their bodies were consumed by insects and small animals. The belief was that their innocent suffering would ensure good harvests and favorable weather. The psychological impact of these rituals extended far beyond the immediate victims. Surviving prisoners were forced to watch these ceremonies, understanding that their own fates could be equally horrific. The knowledge that death might not bring relief, but could instead be transformed into hours or days of unimaginable agony, broke the spirits of even the bravest captives. Viking warriors themselves were not immune to these practices. Captured enemies who had fought with particular skill or courage were sometimes honored with elaborate torture deaths that could last for days. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, but a religious obligation, the belief that the gods demanded suffering proportional to the victim's valor. The ritualistic nature of these tortures reveals something deeply disturbing about Viking culture. This wasn't random sadism or the heat of battle violence. These were carefully planned, religiously sanctioned ceremonies that transformed human suffering into divine worship. The screams of the dying weren't just sounds of agony, they were prayers offered to gods who demanded blood. The Eastern Route, gateway to hell. The great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, aren't just waterways to the Vikings. They were highways of human misery, carrying an endless stream of captives toward markets where slavery took on dimensions that made even Viking bondage seem merciful by comparison. The Eastern Route wasn't just a trade network, it was a pipeline feeding the insatiable appetite of the Islamic world for European slaves. The journey down these rivers was itself a form of torture. Specially modified longships, larger and more heavily built than typical raiding vessels, could carry up to 300 prisoners chained in holds barely 4 feet high. Captives were packed so tightly that lying down was impossible, they could only sit or crouch in positions that became agony within hours. The air in these floating dungeons was thick with the stench of human waste, vomit, and death. Viking traders had perfected a system of way stations along these routes, fortified compounds where human cargo could be refreshed for market. But these stops weren't acts of mercy, they were business necessities. Dead slaves had no value, so prisoners were given just enough food, water, and medical attention to keep them alive for sale. Those too weak to continue were simply thrown overboard, their bodies feeding the fish that followed the slave ships like aquatic vultures. The markets of Kiev and Novgorod were staging areas for an even more horrific journey. Here, Viking traders would sort their human merchandise according to the demands of different markets. Young boys were castrated to create eunuchs for Islamic harems, a procedure that killed roughly half of them but doubled the value of the survivors. Girls as young as 10 were subjected to examinations to verify their virginity, their value dependent on their potential as concubines or breeding stock. The final destination for many was Constantinople, the great city where East met West and where human flesh was traded like any other commodity. The slave markets of the Byzantine capital were vast complexes that could house thousands of captives at once. Here, the systematic dehumanization reached its peak. Prisoners were sorted not just by age and gender, but by specific physical characteristics demanded by different buyers. Islamic traders sought particular types of slaves for different purposes. Fair-skinned Northern Europeans were prized as domestic servants and concubines. Red-haired individuals, particularly women, commanded premium prices for their exotic appearance. Men with specific skills, metalworking, carpentry, literacy, were evaluated and sold based on their potential productivity. But the most valuable cargo was the young and beautiful, destined for the harems of wealthy Islamic nobles. These prisoners faced a fate that combined sexual slavery with complete cultural annihilation. They were trained to speak Arabic, forced to convert to Islam, and taught to perform for their master's pleasure. Their original identities were systematically erased until nothing remained of the people they had once been. The scale of this trade was staggering. Contemporary Islamic sources describe caravans of European slaves stretching for miles across the desert, human chains of misery heading toward markets in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. The prophets were enormous. A single successful expedition down the eastern route could make a Viking trader wealthy for life. The demographic impact on Europe was catastrophic. Entire regions were systematically depopulated by slave raids. The population of Ireland may have declined by as much as 25% during the height of Viking activity. Scotland's coastal areas were so thoroughly raided that some districts remained uninhabited for generations. Archaeological evidence reveals the scope of this human trafficking network. Hoards of Islamic silver found throughout Scandinavia represent the profits of the slave trade. The sheer quantity of this foreign currency suggests that human trafficking was one of the Viking world's primary sources of wealth. They weren't just raiders or explorers, they were the operators of medieval Europe's largest human trafficking organization. The Eastern Route continued to operate for centuries, long after the traditional Viking Age had ended. The demand for European slaves in the Islamic world seemed inexhaustible, and Viking traders evolved into professional slavers who could deliver human cargo to order. They developed sophisticated intelligence networks to identify the most profitable targets, seasonal schedules to maximize captures, and transportation systems that could move thousands of prisoners across vast distances. For the captives who survived the journey to the eastern markets, the nightmare was just beginning. They faced lives of absolute bondage in cultures completely alien to their own, speaking languages they didn't understand, practicing religions that had been forced upon them, serving masters who saw them as exotic animals rather than human beings. The Eastern Route wasn't just a trade network, it was a machine for destroying lives on an industrial scale, a system so efficient and profitable that it operated for centuries, feeding the wealth of Viking society while consuming the lives and freedom of countless thousands of innocent people. Women and children, the most valuable cargo in the brutal calculus of Viking human trafficking. Women and children weren't just prisoners, they were the most valuable commodities in a market that measured human worth in silver and gold. Their capture, transport, and ultimate fate reveal the darkest aspects of a society that had turned the exploitation of the vulnerable into both art and industry. Young women, particularly those between the ages of 12 and 25, commanded the highest prices in every market from Dublin to Constantinople. Their value wasn't measured solely in their capacity for labor, but in their potential for reproduction, sexual service, and exotic appeal. Viking traders developed sophisticated methods for evaluating and preserving this human merchandise, treating women's bodies like valuable livestock that required careful handling to maintain market value. The selection process was ruthlessly efficient. During raids, Viking warriors were trained to identify the most valuable female captives quickly. Noble birth, indicated by fine clothing or jewelry, could triple a woman's price. Physical beauty was assessed according to the preferences of different markets. Byzantine buyers preferred dark-haired women, while Islamic traders paid premiums for fair-skinned redheads. Youth was paramount, women over 30 were often killed immediately rather than burdened with low-value cargo. The treatment of female prisoners during transport reveals the calculated cruelty of the Viking system. Women were kept separate from male captives, not for their protection, but to preserve their value. They were subjected to regular inspections to ensure they remained suitable for sale. Any woman who became pregnant during captivity faced a horrific choice: abortion using crude and dangerous methods, or carrying a child that would reduce her market value and likely be killed at birth. Children represented a different kind of investment. Those under 10 were often killed immediately, too young to work, too expensive to feed, too likely to die during transport. But children between 10 and 15 were incredibly valuable, representing decades of potential labor and the possibility of training for specialized tasks. Young boys could be molded into warriors, craftsmen, or domestic servants. Girls could be raised as concubines or breeding stock, their value increasing as they matured. The psychological warfare directed at women and children was particularly sophisticated. Vikings understood that breaking the spirits of mothers and daughters was key to controlling entire family groups. They would force women to watch as their children were sold to different buyers, ensuring permanent separation. Children were made to witness the sexual assault of their mothers, destroying family bonds and creating trauma that would last lifetimes. The training process for young female slaves was a systematic destruction of identity combined with the creation of new, subservient personalities. Girls were taught to speak Norse, to serve Viking customs, and to please their future masters. They were given new names that emphasized their status as property. Their original languages, religions, and cultural practices were forbidden and gradually forgotten. In the Eastern markets, European women faced fates that combined sexual slavery with complete cultural annihilation. The most beautiful were destined for the harems of wealthy Islamic nobles, where they would spend their lives in gilded cages, their only purpose to provide pleasure and produce children for their masters. Others became domestic servants in households where they would never again hear their native languages or practice their original faiths. Children sold into the Eastern trade faced even more horrific fates. Young boys were often castrated to create eunuchs for Islamic courts, a procedure that killed roughly half of them but doubled the value of the survivors. Those who lived faced lives of absolute servitude, their masculinity destroyed to make them safe servants for their masters' wives and daughters. The most disturbing aspect of this trade was its systematic nature. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic crime, it was an organized industry with established procedures, regular routes, and sophisticated market analysis. Viking traders kept detailed records of which types of women and children sold best in different markets, adjusting their raiding strategies accordingly. The long-term impact on European society was devastating. Entire generations of women and children were lost to the slave trade, creating demographic imbalances that affected population growth for centuries. Some regions lost so many young people that traditional family structures collapsed, leaving communities of the elderly and infirm struggling to survive. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements reveals the scope of this human trafficking. Jewelry, clothing, and personal items from across Europe have been found in Scandinavian sites, representing the possessions of countless women and children who were captured and brought north as slaves. These artifacts are all that remains of lives that were destroyed for profit. The treatment of women and children in the Viking slave trade represents one of history's most systematic campaigns of human exploitation. It reveals a society that had perfected the art of turning human suffering into economic gain, creating systems of oppression so efficient that they operated for centuries, consuming countless lives while generating the wealth that funded Viking expansion across the known world. The conversion trap. When faith became bondage, the arrival of Christianity in Viking lands brought hope to many prisoners. Surely a religion of mercy and forgiveness would end the horrors of pagan slavery. They were catastrophically wrong. Instead of liberation, Christianization created new forms of bondage that were often more insidious than the old pagan systems, trapping slaves in webs of religious obligation that made escape not just impossible, but sinful. Christian Viking rulers quickly discovered that the new religion could be weaponized to create more compliant slaves. Prisoners were forced to convert to Christianity, but this wasn't an act of mercy, it was a tool of control. Christian slaves were taught that their bondage was God's will, that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, and that resistance to their masters was resistance to divine authority. The theological justification for slavery became more sophisticated under Christian rule. Viking priests, many of them former slaves themselves, preached that bondage was a test of faith, that true Christians should accept their lot with gratitude and humility. They cited biblical passages about servants obeying their masters, twisting scripture to create a religious framework that made slavery not just acceptable, but holy. Baptism became a particularly cruel ceremony for slave prisoners. They were told that accepting Christ would make them part of God's family, equal in His eyes to their masters. But the reality was that Christian slaves faced the same brutal conditions as their pagan predecessors, with the added burden of being told that their suffering was spiritually beneficial. The promise of equality in heaven was used to justify inequality on earth. Christian slave owners developed new methods of control that were psychologically more devastating than physical torture. Slaves were taught to confess their sins regularly, which included any thoughts of escape, resistance, or resentment toward their masters. These confessions were used to identify potential troublemakers and to reinforce the idea that slaves were inherently sinful and deserving of their fate. The concept of Christian marriage was perverted to legitimize the sexual exploitation of female slaves. Masters would marry their slave women in Christian ceremonies, giving religious sanction to what was essentially legalized rape. These marriages had no legal standing and could be dissolved at the master's whim, but they created the illusion that sexual slavery was somehow morally acceptable. Children born to Christian slave women faced a particularly insidious form of bondage. They were baptized as Christians and taught that their slavery was part of God's plan for their lives. They were given Christian names and educated in Christian doctrine, but always with the understanding that their faith required absolute obedience to their masters. Christianity became a chain more binding than iron. The church itself became complicit in the slave trade. Monasteries and churches owned thousands of slaves, justifying their bondage as necessary for the maintenance of religious institutions. Priests blessed slave ships before they departed on raiding expeditions, and churches received donations of human cargo from successful raiders. The very institutions that preached love and mercy became some of the largest slave owners in Viking society. Christian festivals became occasions for reinforcing slave status rather than celebrating freedom. During Christmas and Easter, slaves were allowed to participate in religious ceremonies, but always in ways that emphasized their inferior position. They could attend church services but had to sit in designated areas. They could receive communion but only after their masters had been served. Even in worship, hierarchy was maintained. The promise of eventual freedom through Christian virtue proved to be largely illusory. While some Christian masters did free slaves as acts of piety, these manumissions were rare and often came with conditions that kept former slaves tied to their masters' households. Free, Christian slaves often found themselves bound by religious obligations that were as restrictive as legal bondage. Perhaps most cruelly, Christian slaves were taught to be grateful for their condition. They were told that their masters were doing them a spiritual favor by providing them with the opportunity to serve, to suffer, and to demonstrate their faith through obedience. Gratitude became a religious duty, and resentment became a sin that required confession and penance. The psychological impact of this religious manipulation was devastating. Slaves who might have maintained hope for escape or rescue under the pagan system found themselves trapped by their own beliefs. To resist was to sin, to escape was to abandon God's plan, to resent their condition was to fail as Christians. The new religion had created chains for the soul that were stronger than any physical restraints. The conversion of Viking society to Christianity didn't end slavery, it perfected it. By adding religious justification to economic exploitation, Christian Viking rulers created a system of bondage that was more stable, more psychologically devastating, and more resistant to change than anything the pagan world had produced. Faith, which should have been a source of liberation, became the ultimate tool of oppression. The economics of human misery behind every Viking raid, every slave market, every chained prisoner lay a cold economic calculation that reveals the true scope of Nordic human trafficking. This wasn't random violence or cultural barbarism, it was a sophisticated international business that generated wealth on a scale that funded the expansion of Viking civilization across the known world. The numbers tell a story of industrial-scale human exploitation. Conservative estimates suggest that a single successful raiding season could net a Viking chieftain the equivalent of 50 years' income from traditional farming or trading. A healthy adult slave was worth approximately 8 to 12 ounces of silver, roughly equivalent to the price of a small farm or a herd of cattle. Children and skilled craftsmen could command even higher prices, sometimes reaching 20 ounces of silver for particularly valuable specimens. The profit margins were staggering. The cost of mounting a slave raid ships, weapons, provisions, and crew could be recovered with the sale of just 20 to 30 prisoners. Everything beyond that was pure profit. A successful expedition might capture hundreds of slaves, generating returns of 500 to 1,000 on the initial investment. No other economic activity in the medieval world offered such spectacular profits. Viking society restructured itself around this lucrative trade. Traditional seasonal patterns were abandoned in favor of raiding schedules that maximized human captures. Spring raids targeted monasteries and coastal settlements when they were most populated. Summer expeditions focused on market towns during peak trading seasons. Autumn raids caught agricultural communities during harvest time when entire families would be working in the fields. The infrastructure required for this trade was massive. Specialized slave ships were built with reinforced hulls and modified holds designed to transport human cargo. Coastal fortifications were constructed not just for defense, but as processing centers where prisoners could be sorted, evaluated, and prepared for sale. Supply chains were established to provide food, water, and basic medical care to keep valuable merchandise alive during transport. The international nature of the trade required sophisticated financial systems. Viking traders developed credit arrangements with buyers in distant markets, allowing them to finance new expeditions based on promised future deliveries. Currency exchange networks were established to convert Islamic silver, Byzantine gold, and European goods into the various forms of payment demanded by different markets. The specialization within the trade reveals its industrial scale. Some Viking groups focused exclusively on capture, developing techniques for maximum prisoner yield with minimum casualties. Others specialized in transport, operating fleets of slave ships that moved human cargo along established routes. Still others concentrated on sales, maintaining permanent representatives in major markets who could negotiate the best prices for different types of slaves. The economic impact extended far beyond the immediate profits. The wealth generated by the slave trade funded Viking expansion into new territories, financed the construction of fortifications and settlements, and supported the development of new technologies. The silver flowing into Scandinavia from slave sales allowed Vikings to purchase weapons, tools, and luxury goods that enhanced their military capabilities and social status. Regional economies became dependent on the slave trade. Entire communities in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden organized their economic activities around supporting slave raids. Shipbuilders, weaponsmiths, and provision suppliers all profited from the human trafficking industry. Even farmers benefited by selling food and supplies to slave expeditions and by purchasing cheap slave labor for their own operations. The market dynamics were complex and constantly evolving. Prices fluctuated based on supply and demand in different regions. Political upheavals could create sudden demand for specific types of slaves. Military conflicts increased the need for strong laborers, while periods of prosperity drove up prices for domestic servants and skilled craftsmen. Viking traders became experts at reading these market signals and adjusting their operations accordingly. The accounting systems developed for the slave trade were remarkably sophisticated. Detailed records were kept of capture costs, transport expenses, and sale prices. Profit margins were calculated for different types of expeditions, and successful strategies were documented and replicated. These weren't crude barbarians stumbling into wealth, they were calculating businessmen operating a highly efficient human trafficking enterprise. The economic success of the slave trade created a feedback loop that perpetuated and expanded the system. Successful slave traders used their profits to finance larger expeditions, which captured more prisoners, which generated more wealth, which funded even greater operations. The industry grew exponentially, consuming ever larger numbers of victims to feed its insatiable appetite for profit. The true cost of this economic success was measured not in silver or gold, but in human lives destroyed, families shattered, and entire communities devastated. The wealth that built Viking hulls and funded Nordic expansion was purchased with the suffering of countless thousands of innocent people who became nothing more than commodities in a market that valued human beings as livestock. The resistance that never came. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Viking slavery wasn't the brutality of the system itself, but the systematic destruction of any possibility of resistance. Through a combination of physical control, psychological manipulation, and social engineering, the Vikings created a form of bondage so complete that organized rebellion became virtually impossible. The isolation was absolute and intentional. Prisoners were deliberately separated from anyone who shared their language, culture, or homeland. A captured Irish monk might find himself chained next to a Frankish farmer and an English blacksmith, none able to communicate effectively with the others. This linguistic barrier prevented the formation of the relationships necessary for organized resistance. The constant movement of slaves made long-term planning impossible. Just as prisoners began to adapt to their circumstances and potentially form bonds with fellow captives, they would be sold, traded, or relocated. This deliberate disruption of social connections ensured that no stable resistance networks could develop. Slaves never knew if they would wake up in the same place or find themselves on a ship bound for unknown destinations. The Vikings employed sophisticated divide-and-conquer strategies that turned slaves against each other. Slightly better treatment was offered to those who informed on their fellow prisoners. Small privileges, extra food, warmer clothing, less onerous work assignments were used to create hierarchies among the enslaved population. These divisions made unified action impossible and ensured that any resistance plans would be quickly betrayed. The physical constraints were designed to make escape attempts suicidal. Slaves were kept in unfamiliar territories where they didn't know the language, the geography, or the customs. Even if they managed to break their chains, they had nowhere to go and no way to survive in hostile environments. The few who attempted escape faced recapture followed by punishment so severe that they served as deterrents to others. The psychological conditioning was perhaps the most effective tool of control. Slaves were systematically taught that resistance was not just futile, but morally wrong. Those who had been converted to Christianity were told that their bondage was God's will and that rebellion was sinful. Others were convinced that their capture was punishment for some cosmic transgression that could only be atoned for through suffering and submission. The destruction of cultural identity made resistance psychologically impossible for many slaves. When people were stripped of their names, their languages, their religions, and their customs, they lost the very foundations of their sense of self. Without a clear identity to fight for, resistance became meaningless. Many slaves simply forgot who they had been before their capture, accepting their new identities as property. The few instances of slave rebellion that did occur were met with such overwhelming brutality that they served as powerful deterrents to future resistance. Captured rebels weren't simply killed, they were subjected to public tortures so horrific that the memory of their suffering haunted slave populations for generations. The message was clear: resistance leads not to death, but to something far worse. The Vikings also employed psychological warfare that made slaves complicit in their own oppression. Prisoners were forced to participate in the capture and punishment of fellow slaves. They were made to watch executions, to assist in tortures, and to help maintain the very systems that enslaved them. This forced complicity created guilt and shame that made resistance feel like betrayal of their fellow victims. The scale of the system made individual resistance seem meaningless. Slaves could see that they were part of a vast network of human trafficking that stretched across continents. Even if they somehow managed to escape, thousands of others would remain in bondage. This sense of helplessness in the face of an enormous system crushed the spirits of even the most determined individuals. The intergenerational nature of slavery meant that many slaves had never known freedom. Children born into bondage had no memory of liberty to inspire resistance. They were raised to accept their status as natural and inevitable. For them, slavery wasn't an injustice to be fought, it was simply the way the world worked. The absence of outside support made resistance seem hopeless. Slaves knew that their homelands had been unable to protect them from capture and were unlikely to mount rescue operations. They were truly alone in hostile territories, surrounded by people who saw them as property rather than human beings deserving of sympathy or aid. Perhaps most tragically, the Vikings succeeded in convincing many slaves that their situation could always be worse. The threat of sale to the eastern markets, where conditions were even more horrific, kept many prisoners compliant with their current circumstances. The fear of falling further into hell prevented them from attempting to climb back toward heaven. The systematic destruction of hope was the Vikings' greatest achievement in human control. They created a form of slavery so complete, so psychologically devastating, that resistance became literally unthinkable for most victims. The absence of organized rebellion wasn't evidence of acceptance, it was proof of the total success of a system designed to crush the human spirit so thoroughly that the very concept of freedom became forgotten. The legacy of broken souls. The Viking Age officially ended in 1066 with the death of Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but the human cost of 3 centuries of systematic slavery continued to echo through the generations. The descendants of Viking slaves carried scars that went far deeper than the physical marks of bondage. They bore psychological and cultural wounds that would never fully heal. In Iceland, genetic studies reveal the lasting impact of Viking human trafficking. Nearly half of the island's founding population consisted of slaves, primarily women captured from Ireland and Scotland. These women bore children to their Viking masters, creating a mixed population that carried both the DNA and the trauma of their enslaved ancestors. The cultural memory of this forced colonization persisted for centuries, embedded in family histories and folk tales that spoke of ancestors who had been brought across the sea. The demographic impact on the source regions was equally profound. Entire communities in Ireland, Scotland, and northern England never recovered from the systematic depopulation caused by slave raids. Archaeological evidence shows settlements that were abandoned during the Viking period and never reoccupied. The loss of young adults, the most fertile and productive members of society, created demographic imbalances that affected these regions for centuries. The psychological trauma was passed down through generations in ways that modern psychologists are only beginning to understand. Communities that had been repeatedly raided developed what we might now recognize as collective PTSD, persistent anxiety, hypervigilance, and social dysfunction that affected entire populations. The fear of Viking raids became embedded in cultural memory, influencing settlement patterns, architectural choices, and social structures long after the last longship had disappeared over the horizon. The cultural destruction was perhaps the most lasting legacy. Entire languages, customs, and traditions were lost when their carriers were enslaved and scattered across the known world. The rich oral traditions of Celtic communities were broken when storytellers and bards were captured or killed. Religious practices that had survived for millennia were abandoned when their practitioners were forced to convert or die. The economic disruption created by the slave trade had long-term consequences that shaped the development of medieval Europe. Regions that had been repeatedly raided for slaves became economically marginalized, unable to compete with areas that had been spared Viking attention. The wealth that flowed into Scandinavia from human trafficking funded the development of more sophisticated societies there, while the source regions stagnated. The normalization of extreme violence had cultural consequences that extended far beyond the Viking world. The systematic brutality of the slave trade helped establish patterns of dehumanization that would be repeated throughout European history. The techniques developed for controlling and exploiting human beings became part of the cultural toolkit that would later be applied to other forms of oppression and genocide. The religious impact was equally profound. The perversion of Christianity to justify slavery created theological frameworks that would be used to rationalize human bondage for centuries to come. The idea that suffering was spiritually beneficial, that bondage was God's will, and that resistance to oppression was sinful became embedded in Christian doctrine and would later be used to justify everything from serfdom to the Atlantic slave trade. The archaeological record tells its own story of lasting trauma. Excavations of Viking-age settlements reveal evidence of sudden abandonment, burned buildings, and hastily buried treasure hoards, physical remains of communities that lived in constant fear of slave raids. These sites stand as silent monuments to the terror that the Viking slave trade brought to countless thousands of innocent people. The genetic legacy extends beyond simple ancestry to include the biological markers of extreme stress. Studies of ancient DNA from Viking-age burials show evidence of malnutrition, disease, and physical trauma that speaks to the harsh conditions endured by slave populations. These biological scars were passed down through generations, affecting the health and development of entire lineages. The linguistic impact can still be traced in modern European languages. Words related to slavery, bondage, and human trafficking entered various languages during the Viking period and remain embedded in contemporary vocabulary. These linguistic fossils serve as reminders of an era when human beings were routinely bought, sold, and traded like livestock. Perhaps most tragically, the success of the Viking slave trade established precedents and techniques that would be refined and expanded by later civilizations. The systematic dehumanization, the international trafficking networks, the economic justifications, and the religious rationalizations developed during the Viking Age became templates for future forms of human exploitation. The broken souls created by Viking slavery didn't simply disappear when the raids ended. They became part of the genetic, cultural, and psychological heritage of European civilization, carrying forward the trauma of their experiences in ways that continue to influence human society today. The true legacy of Viking slavery isn't found in the wealth it generated or the territories it helped conquer. It's found in the countless lives it destroyed and the generations of descendants who inherited the scars of their ancestors' suffering. The silence of history for centuries after the last Viking longship disappeared into the mists of history, the true scope and horror of Nordic slavery remained largely hidden from public consciousness. This wasn't accidental ignorance, it was deliberate historical amnesia, a collective decision to forget the uncomfortable truths about one of Europe's most celebrated civilizations. The romanticization of Viking culture began almost immediately after their military power waned. Medieval chroniclers, many writing centuries after the events they described, transformed brutal slave raiders into noble warriors and adventurous explorers. The systematic human trafficking that had funded Viking expansion was quietly omitted from these accounts, replaced by tales of heroic battles and daring voyages of discovery. The Protestant Reformation contributed to this historical whitewashing. As Northern European nations sought to establish their own cultural identities separate from Catholic Rome, they embraced their Viking ancestors as symbols of independence and strength. The inconvenient reality that these ancestors had built their wealth on human misery was conveniently forgotten in favor of more palatable myths about brave seafarers and democratic assemblies. The rise of nationalism in the 18th and 19th centuries further distorted the historical record. Scandinavian scholars, eager to glorify their national heritage, focused on Viking achievements in exploration, trade, and craftsmanship while minimizing or ignoring their role in the slave trade. Archaeological evidence of slavery was reinterpreted or dismissed, and contemporary accounts of Viking brutality were dismissed as biased propaganda from their enemies. The academic establishment became complicit in this historical revisionism. University courses on Viking history focused on political structures, military tactics, and cultural achievements while treating slavery as a minor footnote. Textbooks devoted chapters to Viking exploration of North America and their influence on European politics while dedicating only paragraphs to their role in human trafficking. Popular culture completed the transformation of Vikings from slave traders to folk heroes. Novels, films, and television shows portrayed them as noble savages fighting for freedom and honor, conveniently ignoring the reality that much of their society was built on the systematic exploitation of enslaved human beings. The horned helmets and heroic poses of popular imagination bore no resemblance to the slave markets and torture chambers of historical reality. The archaeological evidence was systematically misinterpreted or ignored. Excavations that revealed slave quarters, restraints, and evidence of human trafficking were described in neutral academic language that obscured their true significance. The bones of torture victims were catalogued as examples of ritual sacrifice, without acknowledging the systematic nature of Viking cruelty. The remains of slave ships were studied for their naval architecture while their human cargo was barely mentioned. Even when evidence of Viking slavery couldn't be ignored, it was minimized through false comparisons and historical relativism. Scholars argued that slavery was common in the medieval world, as if this somehow excused the particular brutality and scale of Viking human trafficking. The systematic nature of Nordic slavery was obscured by treating it as just another example of medieval social structures rather than recognizing it as one of history's most efficient human trafficking operations. The voices of the victims were systematically erased from the historical record. While Viking sagas and chronicles were preserved and studied, the accounts of their slaves were lost or ignored. The few contemporary descriptions of Viking brutality that survived were dismissed as biased or exaggerated, leaving the perpetrators to write their own history while their victims remained silent. This historical amnesia had real consequences for understanding human nature and the development of civilization. By sanitizing the Viking legacy, historians created a false narrative that suggested advanced societies could be built without systematic oppression. The lessons that might have been learned from studying Viking slavery about the dangers of dehumanization, the economics of exploitation, and the psychology of oppression were lost to generations of students and scholars. The silence extended to modern Scandinavian societies, which built their contemporary identities partly on romanticized versions of their Viking heritage. Museums and cultural sites celebrated Viking achievements while barely acknowledging their role in slavery. National symbols and cultural narratives emphasized exploration and craftsmanship while ignoring human trafficking and systematic brutality. Recent archaeological discoveries and genetic studies have begun to reveal the true scope of Viking slavery, but this new evidence often struggles to overcome centuries of historical mythology. The popular image of Vikings as heroic warriors and explorers remains so deeply embedded in cultural consciousness that evidence of their role as slave traders is often met with skepticism or denial. The silence of history regarding Viking slavery represents more than just academic oversight. It reflects a broader human tendency to sanitize uncomfortable truths about the past. By choosing to remember the glory while forgetting the horror, we lose the opportunity to learn from history's darkest chapters and to recognize the warning signs when similar patterns emerge in our own time. The true tragedy isn't just that countless thousands of people suffered and died in Viking slavery, it's that their suffering was deliberately forgotten, their stories erased, and their experiences denied the historical recognition that might have helped prevent similar atrocities in the future. As we reach the end of our journey into the darkest corners of Viking history, we're left with truths that challenge everything we thought we knew about one of history's most celebrated civilizations. The Vikings weren't just raiders and explorers, they were the operators of medieval Europe's most sophisticated human trafficking network, a system so efficient and brutal that it consumed the lives of over 500,000 people. The horrors we've uncovered: the systematic breaking of human spirits, the industrial-scale slave markets, the ritual tortures that made death seem merciful, weren't aberrations or exaggerations. They were the foundation upon which Viking society built its wealth, power, and expansion across the known world. Every longship that carried explorers to new lands was funded by the sale of human cargo. Every saga that celebrated Viking heroism was written with silver earned from human misery. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how completely this history was erased, sanitized, and forgotten. The same civilization that perfected the art of human exploitation became the subject of romantic myths and heroic legends. The slave traders became folk heroes, their victims forgotten, their crimes transformed into tales of adventure and discovery. But the evidence remains, carved into bones, buried in archaeological sites, and written in the genetic legacy of their descendants. The truth cannot be hidden forever, and the voices of the victims, silent for 1,000 years, are finally beginning to be heard. What do you think is the most shocking revelation from our exploration of Viking slavery? Was it the systematic nature of their human trafficking operations, the religious justification for torture and brutality, or the complete erasure of this history from popular consciousness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this deep dive into history's hidden horrors has opened your eyes to the darker truths of the past, make sure to subscribe to Scandalous Pasts and hit that notification bell. We're committed to uncovering the stories that history tried to bury, no matter how uncomfortable they might be. Remember, the stories we tell on Scandalous Pasts are fictional narratives that may be inspired by historical events, but they are not presented as historical fact. Our goal is to explore the darker possibilities of human nature and the patterns of behavior that have repeated throughout history. Until next time, remember that the past is never as simple or as noble as we'd like to believe. The truth is often more complex, more disturbing, and more important than the myths we choose to remember. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop seeking the truth, no matter how dark it might be.